Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we are going somewhere that I think a lot of equestrians have felt in their bones, but rarely find the language for. We are talking about aging, not just the horse's aging, though that is very much part of this conversation. We are talking about what happens when you and your horse are both moving through time together, when the body that used to be automatic starts asking for more deliberate attention, when the partnership that was organized around what you could do together starts asking what it might become instead. And I want to say something right at the start before we go anywhere else. If you have ever stood in the barn and felt grief for something that has not ended yet, that is real. If you have ever thought, I can still do this, but it costs me more than it used to, you are not imagining it. If you have ever looked at your horse and felt simultaneously grateful he is still here and heartbroken by what you can see changing, that is not confusion. That is one of the most psychologically complex grief experiences in equestrian life, and it does not have a name in most of the places we look for one. Today, I want to give it several. There are 5 layers to what I want to walk you through today. The first is what this grief actually is and why it hits differently than acute loss. The second is what happens to your nervous system and your body inside this experience. The third is the identity dimension, which I think is the most undernamed part of this entire conversation. The fourth is the specific weight of caregiving and the ethical burden that comes with it. And the fifth is what the research actually shows about how people navigate this well, including some concrete things you can actually do. So let's go. The first framework I want to introduce is what I am calling the living loss model. And I want to start here because I think it reframes everything else. Most of the grief frameworks we reach for are organized around a single event, a loss, a death, a moment that divides time into before and after. Those frameworks matter and they have their place. But the grief of watching a beloved horse age does not work that way. It does not arrive all at once. It arrives in the quality of movement that has changed since last spring. It arrives in the recovery time that has stretched from hours to days. It arrives in the expression that was once intensely forward and is now more considered and careful. Each of these is its own small loss, and each one arrives inside a relationship that is still ongoing. Researchers who study chronic illness and caregiving have a name for this: living loss. Living loss describes the experience of repeated layered losses occurring within an ongoing relationship rather than as a single terminal event. The horse is still here, the relationship continues, but the relationship is changing, and each change is a form of ending embedded inside a continuation. That is a very particular kind of grief to carry, and it is exhausting in a way that is hard to explain to people who have not experienced it, because from the outside, nothing has ended. The horse is still there in the field. He still knows your voice. And yet something is quietly, steadily changing, and you are grieving it in real time without any of the social recognition that grief usually receives. Here is the uncomfortable truth I want to name directly, because I think staying comfortable here does not actually serve you. There will be things you lose in this phase that you do not get back. The partnership at its peak form is not something that gets recovered. It is something that gets honored and then gradually released. And the sooner we can name that honestly, the sooner we can actually be present for what is still here. The living loss model also applies to the rider's own aging, and I want to talk about this directly because I think it gets minimized enormously in equestrian culture. The rider whose recovery used to take hours and now takes days is not failing. The confidence that used to feel automatic and now requires more deliberate maintenance is not a character flaw. And here is where I want to push back on something specific because I hear this framing constantly and it is not accurate. And we tend to talk about physical aging as decline, as getting weaker, as losing what was there. But what is actually happening is something more precise than that. Your system is recalibrating. Your nervous system, which spent decades building automatic responses, is now being asked to rebuild some of those responses more consciously and deliberately. That is not weakness. That is a different kind of work. And the reason it feels so disorienting is not because something is going wrong. It is because your nervous system is genuinely reorganizing how it delivers capacity to you. And that reorganization has an emotional signature that can feel like loss, even when it is also adaptation. The risk calculus that has shifted, where an injury that would have been an inconvenience at 30 becomes a genuinely significant disruption at 60, is not timidity. It is accurate assessment. Your nervous system is not being irrational. It is updating its threat assessment based on current information, and that is exactly what it is supposed to do. The work is not to override that assessment. The work is to ride in a way that is honest about current conditions while still remaining genuinely present with the horse. Now, I want to spend time on what I think is the most clinically important and least named part of this conversation. I am calling it identity grief, and I want to be very direct about what it is. This is not just about losing capacity. This is about renegotiating who you are in the place where you have lived most of your life. For many equestrians, the barn has been the most consistent organizing environment of their adult lives. The identity built there around performance, around the specific form of competence that comes from years of riding at your highest level, around the particular social world of the competition circuit or the training barn, that identity is real and it was earned. And the revision of it, whether it arrives through your own body's changes or through your horse's decline, is a genuine psychological event that deserves to be named as such. Research on identity and aging consistently finds that this transition is one of the most demanding of adult development, not because people are fragile, but because identity reorganization is genuinely hard work, regardless of how mature or self aware the person doing it is. What the research also shows is that the healthiest form of this transition is not replacement, but what I call the identity expansion model. Not finding a new single identity to substitute for the old one, but gradually distributing the psychological investment that was previously concentrated in performance across multiple valued roles. The aging equestrian who has been primarily a competitor for 30 years can become a mentor, a teacher, a keeper of accumulated knowledge, a steward of the relationship with a horse who no longer competes but still needs her completely. None of these is a consolation prize. Each contains dimensions the earlier, primarily competitive identity did not have access to. But I want to be honest about something here because bypassing it does not serve anyone. The grief for the competitive self is real. The specific satisfaction of performance at the highest level you were capable of was a real and irreplaceable thing, and no amount of finding genuine meaning in a different role fully replaces what that role provided. Both things need to be true simultaneously. The new form can be genuinely valuable, and you can still grieve the form it replaced. That coexistence is not contradiction, it is the actual texture of healthy adaptation. If you are in this transition right now, here is something concrete you can try. Write down 3 things your equestrian identity used to be organized around, things that are changing or have already changed. Then, separately, write down 3 things you know about horses, about riding, about this life that took you decades to learn, and that almost nobody around you has yet. Those 2 lists are not in opposition. The second list is where your identity is going. You do not have to abandon what you were. You are being asked to expand into what you also are. The third framework I want to name is present state anchoring. And this is where the research gets practically very useful. One of the most consistent findings in aging resilience research is that the capacity to locate genuine engagement with what is available now, rather than organizing primary attention around what was once available or what might eventually disappear, is one of the most powerful protective factors available. Researchers call this present moment orientation, and the mechanism is specific. It is not that being present makes the grief disappear. It is that it preserves access to what is genuinely here right now, rather than allowing the present to be entirely consumed by comparison with the past or anxiety about the future. For aging equestrians, present state anchoring has very concrete meaning. The horse who is 20 years old is not the horse who was 10 years old, and being with him as though he were, or spending the barn visit primarily organized around grief for what the partnership used to contain, produces a fundamentally different experience than simply being with the horse who is actually there today. The quieter walk, the particular way his attention has shifted, the specific quality of trust that has built through years of shared experience, the fact that he is still there and still interested in you. These are genuinely available right now. They are worth your full attention. Here is a micro practice you can take directly to the barn. Before you enter your horse's stall or go out to the field, pause for 30 seconds and ask yourself one question. What is actually here today? Not what used to be here. Not what you are worried will eventually not be here. What is actually present right now in this animal, in this relationship, in this moment? That single question, practiced consistently, is not a small thing. Research shows it has measurable effects on well being in later life when it becomes a genuine orientation rather than an occasional intention. Now, let's talk about the fourth framework, which I am calling the Caregiver Ethical Load, because I think this is where the psychological weight becomes most concentrated and where equestrians most need honest acknowledgement rather than reassurance. Sustained caregiving for an aging horse is genuinely demanding in ways that go well beyond the physical. The psychological features of long term caregiving that research documents as the heaviest include continuous ethical decision making with imperfect information, the experience of repeated small losses without clear resolution, the isolation of carrying a grief that is rarely recognized as proportionate to its actual weight, and the particular complexity of caring for a being who cannot directly communicate his own experience of what he is going through. The ethical burden of the decisions that arrive in a horse's final season deserves to be named directly. The decisions about treatment, about management, about quality of life, and ultimately about euthanasia are among the most morally significant decisions in equestrian life. They are made with love and with imperfect information, and with the awareness that they will carry moral weight regardless of how thoughtfully they are approached. Research suggests that having honest, specific conversations with your veterinarian about quality of life indicators before you reach the acute phase of decline significantly reduces the cognitive and emotional burden of those decisions without making any of them easy. Knowing in advance what you are watching for and having talked through the threshold with someone who knows the horse gives you something to orient to when the grief is making clear thinking harder. If you are in this phase right now, here is something practical. Ask your vet directly, what are the 3 things you would want me to watch for? Write them down. Keep them somewhere accessible. Not because this removes the difficulty of what is coming, but because having a concrete framework reduces the cognitive load in the moments when your emotional capacity is already fully deployed. And then there is the grief that comes after a euthanasia decision, and I want to name this specifically. The grief of having chosen. Even when the choice was clearly the most compassionate available option, the moral weight of having been the one who decided does not simply dissolve in the knowledge that it was right. Both things can be true at the same time. The decision was right, and it still produces a specific grief that is its own thing and deserves to be named and acknowledged rather than reassured away. You are allowed to grieve the choosing, not only the losing. The fifth framework is what I am calling the Cumulative Resilience model, and I want to offer this as the closing lens because I think it reframes the entire experience of long equestrian life. One of the most consistent findings in aging resilience research is that the capacity to draw on accumulated experience and perspective is one of the central mechanisms of adaptive aging. The equestrian who has been through the death of a horse she loved before brings to each subsequent loss something she did not have the first time. The embodied knowledge that this grief is survivable, that new partnerships can be formed without dishonoring the ones that preceded them, that the love does not diminish through use. Here's the thing about community that the research makes very clear, and that I think equestrian culture actually does well when it allows itself to. The shared understanding available inside a community of people who have been in horses for decades is one of the most powerful grief support structures that exists. The barn friend who also watched her horse age out of the work she had planned together understands without explanation what that transition contains. That shared witness, accumulated over years, is not incidental to equestrian resilience. Research shows it is one of its primary mechanisms. If you have been isolating your grief because you are not sure anyone will understand the weight of it, I want to encourage you to test that assumption. Someone in your equestrian community probably understands more than you think. The rider who arrives at her barn in her sixth or seventh decade knowing exactly what awaits because she has been through it before with other horses she loved, who maintains her relationship with horses despite that knowledge, is doing something that deserves to be recognized as a form of courage. Not recklessness, not denial, courage. The willingness to keep loving something you know you will lose is not naive. After a certain number of years and a certain number of losses, it is one of the most deliberate choices a person can make. Here is the distilled truth I want to leave you with today. Aging in equestrian life is not the end of your story in this world. It is the expansion of what it means to belong to it. The losses are real, the grief is proportionate, and the love that has survived all of it, that is still present in how you approach a horse, in what you know, in what you carry. That love is not a consolation prize for what you have lost. It is the whole point of everything that came before it. Everything we explored today, the living loss model, the identity expansion model, present state anchoring, the caregiver ethical load, and the cumulative resilience model, all of it is drawn from the research in my new book, The Horse-Shaped Whole, Navigating Equestrian Grief, available now on Amazon. This book was written for the rider who has loved a horse through his final season and found herself without a framework adequate to what she was carrying. It was written for the equestrian who is navigating her own body's changing relationship with the sport she has organized her life around and cannot quite find words for the grief in that. It was written for anyone who has ever stood in a barn after a loss and felt the particular, specific weight of a whole that is shaped exactly like a horse. Because the grief you are carrying is not too much. It is not disproportionate. It is exactly proportionate to the love. And that love, no matter how many forms it has had to take over the years, no matter how many endings it has had to survive, is still one of the most remarkable things a human being can choose to do. I am Esther Adams. This is Strides to Solutions. I will see you next time.